Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. I am Steve Portnoy from Servoy USA, and welcome to number 13 in the 30 Minutes with Servoy webinar tech series. Today's is going to be great. We're going to talk about oAuth2 and integration with Servoy. Let me make a couple of announcements. First announcement is Servoy World 2017, coming up in 2 short weeks from now in Amsterdam. There are still spots available, but they are running out quickly. So I urge you, if you've not already registered, to please do so. And it's a great opportunity to have a little longer than 30 minutes with Servoy, let me tell you. Second is our next webinar will be on May 31st in 4 weeks from now because of Servoy World. So just wanted to give everyone a heads up that in 2 weeks there will not be one of these webinars. But again, if you come to Servoy World, you'll get an extended webinar and then some. So I think that's all the announcements we have. Let's hand this over to our good friend Sean.
Thanks, Steve. Just want to check real quick, my screen is visible?
It is visible to me.
Okay.
Oh, and on that note, if anyone does have any questions, there is a questions panel. Please type your questions in there, and then we'll try to get them answered at the end of the webinar. I don't see anybody's response other than mine, so I'm going to assume that everyone can see the screen.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, Servoy World slides, obviously. Okay. Tech webinar series. We are on number 13, which is great. We've gone every 2 weeks all year long. And we're going to keep going except for the next one, as Steve mentioned, because we'll be at Servoy World, but we'll be right back after that. Last week we did war deployment. We try to mix in best practices like doing war deployment with updates about extensions such as web components and open source modules. So today we have another open source update. This one is about OAuth for service integration. On our agenda, we're going to do 2 demos, one with a Google Calendar integration, one with a LinkedIn integration. And then we're going to talk about OAuth because you need OAuth to connect to services like that, but you may have only heard about it, and it helps to know a little bit about what's required. So demo time first, and then we'll look at slides. I'm going to jump into Servoy Developer and launch the NG client. Okay, so we're going to start with Google Calendar. Now, I'll explain this in a minute, but I need a couple of things to access, for my application to access anybody's calendar. I need an ID and a secret. So I'm going to go ahead and copy my ID from a text pad here, as well as my top secret, made it a password field. And I'm going to click this load calendar events, and this is going to start the authorization flow for me to access, now for me as a user, to access my calendar through this registered application. So this is the part where it passes off control to Google, basically to say, okay, well, which one of these accounts do you want? I'll pick this one. And then it says this application called Google APIs for Servoy would like to, and it says blah, blah, blah. In this case, just manage your calendars. So I'm going to click allow. And what this is going to do is pass control back to my application with a token that can then be used for subsequent calls to do things like read the calendar events that I have as a user. So I click allow, and you can see that receive verification code. Now you may close this window. So I close the window, boom, back in Servoy, my calendar events are loaded. I put them in an in-memory data source and put them in a table component so that I could look at, summary, start, end, etc. Okay, let's do a LinkedIn example. It's very similar. I think it's worth pointing out that in some cases you can access, your stuff from a service, but just OAuth itself, these platforms are so big, Google and LinkedIn and Facebook, et cetera, that they serve as authentication as a service. So just for me to know, just for an application to know who you are as a unique person, you can do that even if you're not doing other stuff. So again, I need my client ID and client secret. So paste these in here. Okay, and sign in with LinkedIn. Again, it's passing off control to LinkedIn. I'm going to put in my email and my password. And again, it's saying Servoy, the registered application, would like to access some of your LinkedIn info. And here's the 3 areas. These are called scopes, and I'll explain that in a minute. These are the 3 scopes of the that are being authorized: profile, overview, email address, and the ability to share, comment, and like. Okay, I'll click Allow Access. Again, verification received. Now I may close this window, and as I step back into Servoy, you can see my smiling face and a bit of information from my LinkedIn profile. Okay, pretty simple demo. Let's take a look at some of the code. Let's start with the Google Calendar integration. So here's my form. I entered in the client ID and secret, and I push this button, and it loads the Google Calendar events. So let's start with the OAuth module that I've included. Inside this solution, I have a module called Servoy OAuth, which is available on GitHub, and it has a single scope called Servoy OAuth, and it has some methods in there that we can work with. The first thing I did is, well, I deleted the data that I had in case I'd already loaded it, in case I'm reloading it. Next, I call getClient, which is a method in my form which gets me an authorized client session. This is where I'm actually calling the API, the Servoy OAuth. And what it does is it creates an authorization request using a few key pieces of information which I've embedded as form variables. The authorization URI, we'll discuss that. The token URI, we'll discuss that. You saw the client ID and secret, and then the scopes, which is, in this case, just saying that I can access my calendar. So once you call execute, that's where it actually passes off control to the third-party auth server, and then once you're authorized, it returns control back to here, and we have this thing client, which is an authorized client. So the next thing that I did in my load calendar events method, once I got my client, was I did a HTTP GET request on the events endpoint, which is here. This is part of the LinkedIn service, or sorry, Google Calendar service. So I basically, now that I have an authorized HTTP client session, I can just do an HTTP GET using the token that was given to me. Of course, that's all abstracted by the API, and I can hit this URL and I can get a response. So if you look at what happens when I execute this, it returns a response object, and then I just get the string content here. I do a bit of JSON magic to parse it into an object, and I didn't put the full, it returns a bunch of stuff. I wanted to keep it simple, so I just did summary, description, start and end. I think I didn't even put description on the table. So basically we parse that serialized JavaScript. We can rehydrate it into a JavaScript object, in this case an array of these events. And next is pretty easy. It's just plain Servoy stuff. I iterate over those events in that object, in that array, and I am creating records in a found set and saving them. In this case, that's an in-memory data source. And then I print out a little bit. You can see loaded 250 events, and then it pops up in my form. I had one utility method down here to parse the Google date time string. So that's how that works. The LinkedIn one is very similar. If I go into that, sorry, let's try. If I go into the example LinkedIn form, same sort of thing. I deleted my records first. I got my client. It's the exact same method, except for the auth URI is now pointing to LinkedIn. The token URI is now pointing to LinkedIn. The endpoints here are LinkedIn targets. And the scopes, you saw the three things that it was asking. Do you want access to the base? This application wants access to a basic profile, an email address, and the ability to share. That's what these are here. So I've defined those all as sort of constants. So when I authorize my client, that's my session. Then what I do is I create a GET request and I execute it, same as before, and I parse the serialized JavaScript into an object. In this case, I've got first name, last name, email address, my headline, the number of connections, and my picture URL. All I do is pump those into a new record in my found set. Again, this is a in-memory data source here, and I save it. I had the stuff hidden, so I made it visible after it created it. So that's why it showed up on the form after I was done authorizing. Okay, so that's the code, that's the demo. Let's jump into the presentation. Again, we'll go over some of the concepts that we just saw, and we'll have time for questions, I think. So, we'll do the who, what, when, where, why. What is OAuth? It is an industry standard protocol for authorizing one application to obtain information from another application. It's also a developer specification for the flow of authorization. That's what allows us to write a generic connector for OAuth, and then we can talk to LinkedIn, Google, Twitter, GitHub, whatever it might be, any platform. So what can you do with it? Number one is it gives you secure programmatic access to the services on behalf of your user. So when I provided some of that information, it wasn't the user's information, it was my application's information, which allows any of my users to access their platform and return that information back into my my application. So this is interoperability between two applications without really exposing. You're not giving your password, your LinkedIn password, to the Servoy application. You're authenticating on behalf of the Servoy application with LinkedIn. Finally, I like to emphasize the third point. It's not just about connecting to Google Calendar or to LinkedIn. More and more, you're seeing applications where they do away with their own identity management system completely, and they just outsource that to one of these really well-established platforms and use their identities. So you may see applications nowadays, a lot of times in consumer, but now more and more in business applications, where the user will, instead of getting to a login page where they're doing username and password, it just says log in with LinkedIn, and you click a button, and then it goes to that same screen. You know, this application wants to access your profile. You say allow, and then it knows who you are. You've authenticated. It's secure, and they didn't have to write all of that tech themselves. They just outsourced it to LinkedIn. So how does it work? It's just pretty much a couple of redirects from servers. The first one is you go to your application. You say you want to authorize through LinkedIn, for example, and it forwards you to LinkedIn's auth server. Okay, so then you do your authorization there. That's where you say, yes, I allow this application to see my profile, and then it forwards you to their token server after you've granted permission, and you get a token. Then it redirects back to the client application, in this case the Servoy application, giving it the token, and then the client application can store that token however it wants, but it must issue it with each subsequent request. Eventually a token might expire, you have to refresh it or get a new one. So you need a few things to get started. Every platform that supports oAuth2 will give you the following. It'll have a published auth server URL that shouldn't really change. It will have a published token server URL. Then when you register your application, you as a developer, with, or maybe it's not an application, but just a developer account, with the platform, they'll give you two pieces of info, the client ID and the client secret. The ID just identifies your application in the platform, and the secret is basically your secret access code to authorize your users. The next piece that you need is the scopes. Now this is typically a list of permissions. So you may only be asking for access to read the LinkedIn profile, but you're not asking for their email address, or you're not asking to be able to make posts on their behalf, for example. Same with the Google Calendar. Maybe you just want to see calendars, but you don't want to update events. So they provide a bit of nuance in terms of how they organize their permissions, and you specify what you're authorizing your application to do when you pass in those scopes. And then finally, you just need your service endpoints. So things like, I want to read a calendar, I want to get events, I want to read my LinkedIn profile. There's target URLs for these, and of course you need to know those, but those will all be documented on the platform's documentation. So that's pretty much it. I'm ready for questions. I'll leave this up, some useful links. Always go to the tech series to watch recordings if you missed something, if you want to go back and rewatch something. We keep a thread on the forum for this webinar. We like to hear from you there. Most of the samples that we make, we post at demo.servoy.com in our sample gallery, which we're continuing to maintain. And finally, if you want to get this module, go to GitHub, create an account. You can download the binary with the sample solution. You'll need to go out and get your own client ID and secret from your platform. I should also point out, it's very important, that this module runs on top of the Google OAuth client libraries for Java. So you'll need to download those separately and install them like in your Beans directory. That's all you need to do, and then the module can talk OAuth via those libraries. Steve, I'm ready for questions. We have time.
All right, great. We have two so far. The first question is, can the authentication be saved on the database so that the user does not have to navigate to Google's website every time?
Awesome question. Yes, and you don't even need to worry about it with the library that we're using. It's actually stored on a file system, and if you look here, I have this up in case I got that question. Here I have in user directory.servoy folder that I made, and of course we could configure this to go anywhere, a folder called my OAuth data store, and inside I have credentials for each one of those client IDs. So this is the Google one, and this is the LinkedIn one. These are just a little text file that has the credential information. So, and what's really happening, I think it's worth pointing out, and one of the reasons that I had built this library was because OAuth is kind of complex. There's a lot of moving parts, and one of the things that I found frustrating is that you know, sending someone off to an authentication server is easy enough, but then when you get the token, you have to receive that in a callback. So you as a developer have to have some server that's ready to receive a HTTP post with a token, and then at the same time say, okay, well, I received that token and I'm in the middle of running some method in Servoy. And one of the magic parts about the method where we actually call, we get the authorization client and we execute it, the request, and we get the client. One of the wonderful things about that is that this very line of code is blocking execution, and it's waiting, and then the next line of code resumes once that callback has been received. And so there's a little bit of voodoo magic under the hood with the Google OAuth library. It actually launches an instance of Jetty, which is a embedded HTTP server on an open port, and it's ready to receive the callback. And when it does, it resumes the code right here, and we don't have to worry about it. Handling that part of it and giving you a nice UX that's seamless is the tricky part to OAuth, and that's why I had written this, because we were trying to do some OAuth stuff, and although it was working, the UX was really bad. And so that really helps. And that all, going back to the question, that all happens because then it puts the token here in this location. So the next time I want to authenticate, and I can demo that, let's say I close this, I come back and relaunch my application. Let's go to LinkedIn. Let me get my client secret. and my ID. I didn't have to leave, so to answer finally the user's question, I didn't have to leave my application and go off and do that every time. I kept the token, it stays right here, and until that token is deleted or expires, and it will auto refresh too when it expires, but until, if we lose it for some reason, then we have to go back and do it. So it's quite nice.
Okay. There are two other questions that are sort of similar, and they're both asking what's the difference between this module and the OAuth plugin from Servoy Forge, and can you use it for other things like contacts, like you can with the Servoy Forge plugin?
Right. So there's a plugin on Servoy Forge, which is a bit older and based on, instead of the Google libraries, it's based on something called Scribe, which is another Java library. The reason that I had created this, not really to redo any work that was already done or to compete with another project, is that two things. One is that the Scribe one is a bit more complex. If you want to, it already has like built-in support for a few platforms, but if you want to add a platform, in particular, I was trying to do an integration a few months back with Resource Guru, which is a scheduling platform, and Scribe wouldn't let me do it unless I, built my own like provider inside of it, and so that wasn't working for me. The other thing is that this handles that callback on that Jetty server, the embedded server, and keeps it all seamless, which I really like from a UX point of view. So this one has a bit different features and it's a bit newer, and it will be actively maintained on GitHub.
All right, one last question from Patrick. Can the token be stored in the database as well instead of the file system? So is there a way to get it from the scope method?
Yeah, so in the API that we expose, no, but we're open to enhancements. So this is first of all, this is available on GitHub as the first beta release for folks to use, and I'm sure there will be requests as people use it for things like that. So right now it stores the token in the current working directory on the server machine. But there are options for where you'd like to store the token, and the database is certainly one of them. So we're open to that option. It would just have to be exposed via the API. So get to GitHub and file an issue.
All right, I think that was the last question.
Cool.
All right, well, thank you very much, Sean, and thank you everyone for attending, and we will see you in 2 weeks at Servoy World.
4 weeks.
4 weeks?
Oh, well, yeah.
Well, we'll see you in 4 weeks at the webinar.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks at Servoy World. The May 31st, as you can see, the webinar will be a Servoy World recap if you miss it, but really it's just going to be a pale comparison to the actual thing. So we hope to see you there.
It'll just make you sad when you watch
Exactly.
it.
Yeah, really. You'll hear all about the great things that you missed, which, who likes that?
Unless you went, then it'll be happy memories.
Exactly. All those inside jokes and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and have a great day, evening, afternoon, what have you. Bye-bye.